Are you back? So you can't sleep without other people's secrets again. Let's tear this night apart and see what's hidden in the dark. Mark drove through the dusty streets of Pineville, humming an old tune he and Emily had loved back when their dates ended with long walks in the park. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a soft, golden light over the town that reflected off the cracked storefronts and old wooden fences. In the back of his truck was a bottle of Chardonnay, her favorite, with a subtle aroma of peach and vanilla that she had once called summer in a glass. Next to it was a bouquet of peonies, bright pink and slightly bruised, but still smelling so sweet that Mark couldn't help but smile as he remembered Emily clutching a similar bouquet to her face on the day of their engagement. He had left work early for the first time in months, so he could have a romantic evening. Their marriage had been strained lately. The endless shifts at the factory where he fixed computers, her exhaustion from schoolwork, the petty arguments that had accumulated like dust in the corners of their old house. But today he wanted to fix it, to bring back that light in her eyes that had once made his heart beat faster. Pineville was a tiny Missouri town where 5,000 people knew each other by name and gossip traveled faster than the smell of freshly mown grass. There was one supermarket, 2 stoplights, and a diner called Joe's with a sign that creaked and seemed to complain with every gust of wind. Mark was born in this town, where he became friends with Steve when they were 7 years old. Together they built huts in the woods behind the school, stole apples from old Mrs. Henderson's orchard, and dreamed of one day going off to conquer the world. "Hey, Mark," Steve would say then, handing his friend an apple. "You'll see, in 10 years we'll be living in New York and riding in black limousines." "Well, yeah, Steve, of course," Mark laughed, wiping the apple on his shirt. "And I'll be president, and you'll be my bodyguard." Steve was his shadow, his soul brother, the man who had toasted at their wedding, laughing that Mark had stolen the best girl in Pineville. Emily came later, arriving in town as a primary school teacher. Her smile and ability to find common ground with children quickly made her a local favorite, and for Mark she became everything: his home, his future. He remembered the first time he approached her after the parents' meeting. "Emily," he began hesitantly, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Yes," she turned and smiled so warmly that his throat went dry. I, I just wanted to say, you are great with kids." She laughed, biting her lips slightly. "Thank you, Mark. I'm trying. Maybe you want to get coffee sometime. Joe's, maybe. The coffee is terrible there, but they have the best pies in town." Emily looked at him and nodded. "Okay, only if you promise not to talk about work." "Agreed," Mark grinned. From then on, Joe's was their place. They sat at a corner table, drank watered coffee, and made plans for a future in which Pineville was just a comfortable starting point. One day Steve sat down next to them, clapping Mark on the shoulder. "Well, my lovebirds, when is the wedding already?" he grinned. "Steve," Emily burst out laughing. "You don't even know if I've been proposed to." "Hey," Mark threw up his hands. "I haven't figured out how to do this yet." Okay, Steve raised his palms. "Just remember, buddy, you're not just marrying her, you're marrying all of us. I'll be living on your couch." "Don't even think about it," Emily said, laughing. That's what it was like, their little world. With a creaking cafe sign, with Mrs. Henderson's apples, with childhood pranks that became memories, and with dreams that sometimes did come true. He parked the truck in front of the house, turned off the engine, and wiped the sweat from his forehead. The fatigue of a long day at the plant was still heavy on his shoulders, but the anticipation of an evening with Emily made it easier. He could already imagine her surprise at the flowers, how they would sit in the backyard listening to the cicadas, and maybe talk about going to Italy again, like on their honeymoon. He pulled the bouquet and the bottle out of the trunk, straightened his shirt, and headed for the porch. An old blue Ford, Steve's car, was parked at the curb. Mark stopped, frowning. Steve hadn't called to say he was coming. Maybe something was wrong. Emily often discussed school with Steve. He owned a local hardware store and helped with craft supplies for the kids or with renovating classrooms. He must have stopped by to ask a question, Mark thought. but a small twinge of worry stabbed at his chest. He shrugged, pushing the bad thoughts away, and stepped toward the door. The door was slightly open. It was odd, Emily always locked it, even during the day, ever since the neighbor's cat had snuck in and wreaked havoc in the living room, smashing her favorite vase. Mark pushed the door open, and it creaked, breaking the silence. The house was silent, only the sun shining through the curtains, making golden streaks on the faded carpet. He set the wine and flowers on the kitchen table, took off his shoes so as not to trample them, and called, "Emily, are you home?" Silence answered him, but somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked, as if someone had carelessly stepped on an old board in the hallway. Mark's heart began to beat a little faster, but he brushed the premonition aside. He was probably in Steve's office with him, discussing another school project or charity fundraiser. He adjusted the bouquet in his hand and climbed the stairs, skipping the third step, which always creaked like an offended cat. It was quiet on the second floor, but a sound came from the bedroom, Emily's laughter, light, almost girlish, the likes of which he hadn't heard in years. Mark smiled, feeling warmth in his chest. She was in a good mood, a good sign for their evening. He pushed the bedroom door, and the world stopped. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her hair disheveled and falling in thin, dark strands across her face. She ran her fingers nervously down the collar of her white blouse. The buttons were undone too far, the fabric slipping slightly off her shoulder, revealing pale skin and the narrow edge of her bra strap. There was still a faint mark on her neck from Steve's lips, red as wine in a glass. She laughed softly, a laugh that seemed to escape from the heat in her veins. Steve stood across from her, barefoot, with the belt of his jeans open. His shirt was lying at his feet, next to one of Emily's shoes. He held the bottle of wine by the neck and poured her more, not taking his eyes off hers, heavy, long, in which some greedy tenderness burned, and something a little rougher. "Isn't that too much wine?" she asked, taking the glass in both hands. Her voice trembled, but not from the cold. "For you?" Steve grinned, leaning his elbows on the nightstand. "Never too much." He leaned toward her, running his fingers through her hair, tucking it behind her ear. She looked up and parted her lips slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but only exhaled, barely noticeable, offering him her neck. He touched her skin with his lips, slowly, almost lazily, leaving a wet mark where her collar had been. Emily closed her eyes and laughed softly, throwing her head back to meet him. The crumpled sheet on the bed beneath her still bore the marks of their bodies, careless and careless. Steve straightened up, looked at her, then at the bottle, and refilled his glass. "Steve," she said quietly, touching his wrist with her fingertips. "You understand what we're doing, right?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked down at her palm and ran his finger along the inside of her hand, so slowly that she flinched. "I understand," he said finally, and smiled in such a way that there were no schoolboys or friends left in it. "But I don't care right now." Emily laughed again, short and hoarse, and raised her glass to her lips. The wine left a red mark on the corner of her mouth. She ran her tongue over her lips and sat closer to him, placing her hand on his thigh, pulling him slightly towards her, as if she was hesitating or, on the contrary, not wanting to rush. And behind the door, behind the wall of warm twilight and the smell of perfume, Mark was already standing, not having yet opened the door, not having yet seen anything, but already feeling that everything had changed. Mark stood frozen in the doorway, his fingers still clutching the bouquet of peonies, the petals trembling as if they sensed his turmoil. The blood pounded in his temples, loud as a drum, drowning out everything else. His throat tightened, as if someone had pulled an invisible noose, and he couldn't breathe in or out. He looked at them, at Emily, whose smile was frozen into a mask of horror, at Steve, whose shoulders were tense like a man caught in the act. It was impossible, wrong, like a nightmare he should wake up from, but it was still there. The bottle of wine, the glasses, the rumpled sheet, her disheveled hair, his bare chest, it was all real, and every detail cut into his consciousness like a knife. Emily noticed him first. Her eyes widened, and she jumped out of bed, hurriedly pulling on her blouse. "Mark, oh my God, Mark, it's not what you think." Her voice was shaking, but there was no sincerity in it, only panic, like a child caught in the act. She took a step toward him, holding out her hand, but he didn't move, his feet rooted to the floor. Her words rang hollow, like an echo in an empty house, and he couldn't bring himself to believe a single word. Steve turned, his face chalk white. He rubbed his neck, an old nervous gesture Mark had learned from childhood, when Steve was trying to talk his way out of trouble. Bro, listen, we just... He trailed off, at a loss for words, and the silence was worse than any lie. His eyes, usually so sure, were now avoiding Mark's, staring at the floor, as if there was salvation there. Not what I think. Mark's voice was hoarse, almost alien, as if it belonged to someone else. He looked at Emily, at her shaking hands clutching the hem of her blouse, then at Steve, who was still standing like a statue, not daring to look up. Then what is it? His voice broke, and he felt anger, hot and acrid, rising in his chest. What did I just see? My wife and my best friend in our bedroom with my wine on our bed. What is it, Emily? Steve, explain to me what I saw. Emily opened her mouth, but the word stuck. She looked at Steve for support, but he was silent, his face blank as a faded photograph. Mark, please let me explain, she finally managed, her voice shaking like an autumn leaf ready to fall from its branch. She took another step toward him, but he didn't move, his body tense as a string ready to snap. Explain, Mark laughed, but it was bitter as vinegar, and his voice echoed off the bedroom walls. He was still clutching the bouquet, and the peonies, so bright and innocent, seemed like a mockery now. He wanted to throw them on the floor, to trample them, but his fingers wouldn't obey. His eyes darted from Emily to Steve, from the rumpled sheets to the glasses, from her disheveled hair to his bare chest. His thoughts tangled like the wires in the old computer he'd been fixing last week. How long has this been going on? How could he not notice? All those nights Emily stayed late at meetings, all those times Steve stopped by on business, all the glances they exchanged at the neighbor's barbecue, it was all there, but he was blind and stupid. Steve took a step forward, raising his hands in surrender. Mark, it's not. We didn't want you to know. It's just... He stopped again, and his voice trailed off, as if he didn't believe what he was about to say. Just? Mark took a step toward him, and Steve involuntarily retreated. Anger boiled in his chest, but behind it was a pain so sharp it seemed to tear him apart from the inside. He looked at Emily, whose eyes were full of tears, but there was no remorse in them, only fear. He looked at Steve, who was still rubbing his neck, as if hoping that this gesture would erase reality. The bedroom, their bedroom, where he and Emily had laughed, planned the future, dreamed of children, was now alien, desecrated. The bottle of wine on the nightstand, which he had chosen with such love, was a slap in the face. The peonies in his hand, a symbol of their past, now seemed like poison. Mark stood in the doorway, unable to move. His feet were rooted to the floor, his thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of anger, pain, and disbelief. He wanted to scream, to hit, to cry, but all he could do was stand there and look at them, at the people he loved most in the world, and feel his world crumble. Emily was still talking, her voice distant like the sound of the wind outside the window. Steve tried to add something, but his words were lost in the ringing silence that filled the bedroom. Mark didn't move, his gaze riveted on them, and he knew that this moment, this image Emily, Steve, the crumpled sheets, the wine would stay with him forever, like a scar that would never heal. Mark stood in the bedroom doorway, his fingers still clutching the bouquet of peonies, their petals trembling as if in a wind, but the room was as silent as a grave. His gaze darted from Emily, whose blouse was still unbuttoned, to Steve, who was awkwardly rubbing his neck, avoiding his eyes. The rumpled sheets, the bottle of wine on the nightstand, his wine, bought for their anniversary, and the two half-empty glasses were like evidence in a court of law, where he was simultaneously victim, judge, and executioner. The blood pounded in his temples, drowning out everything but the ringing silence that followed his question. What did I just see? Emily and Steve were silent, their faces masks hiding the truth, but their panic gave everything away. Emily was the first to break the silence, her voice shaking like a thin branch in the wind. "Mark, please, it's not what you think. We just—" She trailed off, her eyes darting from Mark to Steve, as if searching for a clue, but Steve only cleared his throat, still looking at the floor. "Just what?" Mark's voice was hoarse, as if someone had ripped all the emotion out of him, leaving only anger. He stepped forward, and the bouquet in his hand snapped, a few petals falling to the carpet, bright as blood. "Just drinking my wine, just sitting on our bed, just taking our clothes off. What, Emily? What are you trying to tell me?" She stepped back, her hands still clutching the hem of her blouse, trying to fasten the buttons, but her fingers were shaking, and she was only getting more tangled up. We were talking about a school project. Steve came over to discuss the sponsorship, and we just had a few drinks. That's it, Mark, I swear." Her eyes were filled with tears, but Mark saw no remorse in them, only fear of being caught. Steve finally looked up, his face chalk white. "Bro, look, it's true. We were just chatting, and, well, the wine was out, so we decided to have a drink. It wasn't anything, honestly." His voice was weak, like he didn't believe it himself. He took a step toward Mark, but stopped when he saw him tense up. "Bro," Mark laughed, but it was as harsh as breaking glass. "You're standing half naked in my bedroom with my wife, and you call me bro? Are you serious, Steve?" He turned to Emily, his gaze so hard that she flinched. "And you, Emily, expect me to believe that you were discussing a school project in our bedroom with the wine I bought for us?" Emily opened her mouth, but the words stuck. She looked at Steve, her eyes begging him to say something, but he just rubbed his neck, an old nervous gesture Mark had known since they were kids. "Mark," she finally managed, "it was a mistake. We just, it wasn't what you think. We didn't, nothing happened." "A mistake?" Mark stepped closer, and she backed away from the bed, bumping into the rumpled sheets. "You call this a mistake? You're sitting here with him in our bedroom, and it's a mistake? What the hell, Emily? How long were you going to fool me?" Steve held up his hands in surrender. "Mark, I swear it's not what it looks like. We just, well, we had a few drinks and things got twisted. It's not what you think, really." His voice was shaking, and Mark could see the sweat beading on his forehead. Steve had always been a bad liar, even back in high school. When they'd cut class, he'd give it away with his nervous smile. Swirl, Mark felt the anger boiling in his chest like lava ready to burst forth. He threw the bouquet to the floor, and the peonies scattered across the carpet, their sweet scent mixing with the heavy air of the room. "You mean you just happened to be half naked on my bed? What is this, Steve? Just swirl? Do you think I'm an idiot?" Emily began to cry, her shoulders shaking and her hands covering her face. "Mark, please forgive me. It was a one-time thing, I swear. I don't know how it happened. We were drinking and I didn't mean to." Her voice broke, but Mark felt no pity. Her tears seemed like theater to him, a cheap attempt to beg forgiveness for something that could no longer be undone. "One time," he nearly shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "You expect me to believe that this was the first time? That you and my best friend just happened to be having a drink in our bedroom? Do you think I'm blind?" He turned to Steve, his fists clenching. "What about you, Steve? What do you think? Is this your first time too? Or are you just getting used to coming in here while I'm working at the factory?" Steve opened his mouth, but found no words. He retreated toward the window, his hands still raised as if he could protect himself from Mark's anger. "Mark, I didn't mean for this to happen. It's just a mistake. We didn't plan." "A mistake?" Mark took a step toward him, and Steve flinched as he bumped into the windowsill. The glasses on the nightstand clinked, one almost falling over. "You're standing in my bedroom with my wife, and you call this a mistake? You were my friend, Steve, my brother. How could you?" Emily tried to intervene, her voice almost a whisper. "Mark, please, let's talk. Not here, not like this. I'll do anything to fix this. I love you, you know that." "You love me?" Mark looked at her, and there was not only rage in his eyes, but also pain, so deep that it seemed to tear him apart from the inside. You're sitting here with him in our house on our bed, and you're telling me that you love me. Do you even know how that sounds? She took a step toward him, holding out her hand, but he retreated, his back against the door frame. Don't touch me, he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. I don't want to hear your lies, not yours or his. Steve finally found the strength to speak. Mark, look, it's my fault. I shouldn't have. But it's not her fault. It was me. I asked for it. Don't blame her, okay? Mark looked at him, and for a moment he wanted to punch, to smash that face he'd known since childhood, that had been there for him during the darkest moments of his life. But he held back, his fists shaking but staying in place. You asked for it, and what? She just agreed. Both of you betrayed me. And now you want me to blame only you. It won't work, Steve. You're both to blame. Emily sniffled, tears streaming down her cheeks, but Mark felt nothing but emptiness. Get out, he said, his voice as cold as the winter wind. Both of you, now. Steve grabbed his shirt off the floor, pulling it on quickly. Mark, let's talk like men. Don't do this. We can work this out. His voice was pleading, but Mark wasn't listening. Work it out? He almost laughed, but it caught in his throat. You slept with my wife, Steve, in my house. How are you going to work it out? Emily tried again. Mark, please, don't do this. We can fix this. It was a mistake, I swear. It was the first time. I've never. Enough, Mark barked, and she fell silent, her eyes wide with fear. I don't want to hear your first-time stories. Get out of my house. Now. Steve took a step toward the door, but stopped, looking at Mark. I'm sorry, bro. Really? His voice was barely audible, but Mark didn't respond. He watched Steve walk past, his footsteps echoing down the stairs, the front door slamming behind him. Emily remained, her shoulders shaking but not moving. Mark, she whispered, please don't throw me out. I don't know how this happened. I'm just confused. I love you. You have to believe me. He looked at her tear-stained face, at her disheveled hair, and felt something inside him break. Do you love me? His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but there was such pain in it that Emily flinched. You were sitting here with him, laughing, drinking my wine, and you say you love me? How can you lie like that? I'm not lying, she nearly screamed, her voice breaking. It was a mistake, Mark. I didn't mean for this to happen. We were drinking, and I don't know how this happened. Please, give me a chance. A chance? He shook his head, his eyes empty. You think I can just forget this? That I can go back to this bedroom, lie in this bed, and pretend it never happened? You ruined everything, Emily, everything. She took a step toward him, but he raised his hand, stopping her. Go away, he said, his voice hard as stone. I don't want to see you. Not now. Maybe never. Emily froze, her face twisted in pain, but she nodded, wiping away her tears. She grabbed her bag from the chair and walked toward the door, her steps unsteady, like someone who had just lost everything. The door slammed behind her, and the house was filled with a silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing down on her chest. Mark remained in the bedroom, his gaze still fixed on the rumpled sheets, the glasses, the bottle of wine. He felt the anger and pain fighting inside him, like two beasts tearing him apart. He wanted to scream, to punch the walls, but instead he just stood there, his breathing heavy, as if he had run a marathon. He didn't know how much time had passed, minutes, hours, but at some point he realized he couldn't stay in this house, in this room that still smelled of her perfume and betrayal. He walked down the stairs, not looking at the scattered peonies, which now seemed like a mockery to him. He grabbed the keys to the truck and walked outside without locking the door. Night had fallen over Pineville, and the stars, usually so bright, seemed dim, as if someone had turned off the lights in his world. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove, not knowing where. The town flashed past the window familiar houses, Joe's, the park where he had first kissed Emily. Everything seemed foreign, like the setting for his own personal hell. He pulled up to an old park on the outskirts of town where he and Steve had built shelters as children. He killed the engine and leaned back, feeling the fatigue and pain pressing down on him like a slab of concrete. His thoughts were a jumble. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't he noticed? And worst of all, did anyone else know? Pineville was cramped. Nothing was a secret. The thought made him sick. He closed his eyes, but the images wouldn't go away. Emily laughing with a glass of wine, Steve standing in his bedroom, the sheets rumpled. Mark stayed in the car, listening to the cicadas sing their endless song. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear: his life as he knew it was over. He sat in the dark, alone, in a pickup that smelled of gasoline and old leather, and felt the emptiness filling him from the inside. The night had been long, and it promised to be only the beginning of his torment. Morning came with a deceptive gentleness in Pineville, as if the town had decided to feign innocence. The sun rose lazily over the horizon, casting a pale light on the narrow streets that reflected off the peeling facades of the houses and glittered on the dew-covered lawns. Mark woke up in his truck, parked in an old park on the outskirts of town, with a stiff neck and a bitter taste in his mouth. His clothes smelled of sweat and last night's disappointment, and the rearview mirror reflected a face he barely recognized. Bags under his eyes, stubble, a look of weariness and something else, a rage that smoldered like embers beneath ashes. He rubbed his temples, trying to clear away the images that had haunted him all night. Emily, her hair wild, Steve standing in their bedroom, and a bottle of wine that now seemed to symbolize everything he had lost. He started the engine, and the truck coughed to life. Mark wasn't sure where he was going, but he couldn't bear to go back to the house with the smell of her perfume still lingering. He headed toward the center of town, to Joe's diner, where the locals gathered every morning to swap news over coffee and eggs. The diner was the heart of Pineville, a place where gossip was born, where farmers discussed their crops, and old ladies tumbled over lives like beads on a rosary. Mark wasn't sure why he was going there, but sitting in the car, listening to his own thoughts, was unbearable. As he parked outside the cafe, the sign above the entrance creaked in the wind, as if greeting him with sarcasm. He stepped out of the car, feeling the morning chill creeping under his shirt. The street was almost empty, except for Mrs. Carter, a neighbor 3 doors down, walking her terrier, who tapped at a passing bicycle. She noticed Mark and froze, her eyes, usually so curious, now full of awkwardness. "Morning, Mark," she said, but her voice was taut, like a string about to snap. She quickly looked away, concentrating on the leash, as if the dog had suddenly become the center of her world. "Good," Mark muttered, feeling her gaze burn into his back as he turned toward the cafe. Something in her tone, her hasty attempt to avoid the conversation, pricked him. He remembered how Mrs. Carter always chatted with Emily on the porch, how they laughed as they discussed school gossip. Did she know? The thought was like a splinter that had lodged itself in his mind and begun to fester. The inside of Joe's smelled of freshly brewed coffee and burnt bacon. A few regulars were sitting at the counter. Bill, a farmer from the suburbs, sipped coffee and leafed through the newspaper, and Linda, the supermarket cashier, chatted with a waitress. When Mark walked in, the conversations died down, as if someone had turned down the volume. Joe, the bartender, whose hands were always busy polishing the bar, looked up and nodded, but his smile was strained, like a man who knew more than he was letting on. "Mark, how are you?" he asked, but his voice was too careful, as if he were afraid to prick an invisible wound. "Fine," Mark said, sitting down at the bar. He could feel the other's eyes sliding over him like blades, thin and sharp. Linda coughed, spooning around her cup, and Bill was suddenly too engrossed in his newspaper, though Mark knew he could barely read. The silence was heavy, like the air before a storm, and Mark knew they knew. They all knew. He ordered coffee, but it didn't come. System. Joe's fingers paused on the coffee pot. He looked at Mark, his eyebrows raised. "Black, no sugar, huh?" he asked, but there was an awkwardness in his voice, as if he were trying to fill the silence. "Yeah," Mark nodded, not looking at him. His fingers curled around the edge of the counter, and he felt the anger that had been smoldering inside him since last night begin to flare. And lots of milk. Joe nodded and turned back to the coffee pot, and Mark looked at the other customers. Linda looked away quickly, her cheeks flushed as if she had been caught in the act of doing something shameful. Bill cleared his throat, turning the page of the newspaper, though his eyes were fixed on Mark. This wasn't just curiosity. This was knowledge they had kept from him while he lived his happy lie. The coffee appeared in front of him, and Mark wrapped his hands around the hot mug, feeling it burn his palms. He didn't drink, just stared at the black liquid, trying to collect his thoughts. Last night was playing in his head. Emily, her shaky voice, Steve, his pathetic excuses, the rumpled sheets. But now there was a new feeling added to those images, the feeling that all of Pineville had been looking at him like he was a fool all these years. He left the cafe without finishing his coffee and headed for his truck. On the street, he ran into Tom, a co-worker from the plant, who was hauling a box of tools toward his truck. Tom was always a funny guy, fond of jokes, but today his face was serious, almost guilty. "Hey, Mark, how are you?" he asked, stopping next to him. "Alive," Mark replied, his voice as sharp as a blade. He saw Tom look away, rubbing the back of his head. "Well, if anything, you know, I'm always here," Tom said, but his words sounded empty, like a politician's promise. He knew. Mark could see it in his eyes, in the way he shifted from foot to foot, as if he wanted to run. "Thanks," Mark said, getting into the car. He slammed the door, feeling anger and shame mix in his chest like a toxic cocktail. Tom knew, Mrs. Carter knew, Joe knew, they all knew, and no one said a word to him. He drove to the factory where he fixed computers in a small office littered with old monitors and wires. His boss, Mr. Hayes, was in his office, but when he saw Mark, he came out with a mug of tea in his hand. "Mark, you're early today," he said, but his smile was too forced and his eyes avoided direct eye contact. "I decided not to waste time," Mark replied, sitting down at his desk. He turned on his computer, but his fingers hovered over the keyboard. The office was quiet, but he could hear whispers through the partition, the voices of his colleagues, Tina and Paul, who he knew were sitting in the next room. "Poor guy, I told you she was too good for him," Paul's voice came, quiet but loud enough for Mark to hear. Tina mumbled something in response, but Mark couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. He knew what they were talking about. He stood up, his chair creaking, and the whispers behind the partition died down. He walked out into the hallway, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. Tina peeked around the corner, her eyes full of pity. "Mark, are you okay?" she asked, but her voice was too soft, as if she were talking to a sick child. "Fine," he snapped, walking past. He didn't want their pity. He wanted the truth, but the truth was unbearable. The whole town knew. All these people he'd said hello to every morning, had a beer with at barbecues, shared his life with, all of them had remained silent while his world crumbled. He went to the local supermarket for a sandwich on his lunch break, but there was another meeting waiting for him. Standing in line at the checkout was Emily's sister Sarah, who had always been cold but polite to him. Today she looked different. Her lips were pressed tightly together, her eyes avoiding his. "Mark," she said as he approached the checkout, but her voice was barely audible. "Hi, Sarah," he replied, feeling the tension creep into his shoulders. He noticed the way her fingers fiddled nervously with the strap of her bag, the way she looked away, as if afraid he would read the truth in her eyes. I heard that yesterday. Well, you know," she began, but stopped when she saw his face. Mark was silent, his eyes heavy as lead. "Emily didn't tell me anything," she added quickly, "but people do." "People say," Mark repeated, his voice cold as ice. "And what exactly do they say, Sarah?" She blushed, her fingers tightening around the strap. "Well, you know, rumors. That you and Emily and Steve." She trailed off, her cheeks burning. "I don't believe rumors, Mark, really. But people say." Mark felt something inside him tighten, as if someone had squeezed the last drops of hope out of him. "People say," he said quietly, almost a whisper. What about you? What do you think, Sarah? You're her sister. Did you know? Her eyes widened and she took a step back. I didn't know anything, Mark. I swear I would have told you. But her voice was shaking, and Mark knew she was lying. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she looked away, in the way her hands shook as she took out her purse. Sure, he said, picking up his sandwich and walking away from the register. He didn't want to hear her excuses. He didn't want to hear anyone's excuses. He wanted the truth, but the truth was too hard. All of Pineville knew his wife was sleeping with his best friend, and no one had said a word. By the end of the day, Mark felt like he'd been crushed. He got back into his truck, which still smelled of last night, and drove through town, not knowing where he was going. He passed familiar places, the old oak tree in the park where he'd first kissed Emily, the auto shop where he and Steve had fixed his first car, Mrs. Carter's house where Emily liked to drink tea on the porch. All of this had been his life, his home, but now every corner of Pineville felt like a cage full of lies. He stopped at a bridge over a river that flowed lazily on the edge of town. The water was as murky as his thoughts. He got out of the car and leaned against the railing, looking at his reflection in the river. The man looking back at him was a stranger broken, betrayed, alone. He remembered Sarah's words, people talk, people talk, people knew. His friends, his neighbors, his co-workers, even his sister-in-law, they all knew, and no one said a word to him. He gripped the railing so tightly that the metal bit into his palms. The anger that had been smoldering inside him since last night flared up again, but now it wasn't just aimed at Emily and Steve. It was aimed at all of Pineville, at this small, cramped town that had looked at him like he was a fool and said nothing. He knew he couldn't just go on pretending nothing had happened. Something inside him had changed, as if the betrayal had burned away a part of his soul, leaving room for something new, something dark that he didn't yet understand. Mark got back into the car, his hands shaking as he put the key in the ignition. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but one thing was clear. He would not be a victim. He would not let Pineville laugh at him behind his back. He would find a way to make them all pay, not with his fists, not with his screams, but with something far more destructive. Tuesday morning in Pineville was gray, as if the sky had decided to reflect Mark's mood. The clouds hung low and heavy over the town, promising rain that never came, as if taunting him with their indecision. Mark woke up in his truck, parked by the river on the outskirts of town, where he had spent another night because he couldn't bear to go back to the house that still smelled of Emily's betrayal. His back ached from the uncomfortable seat, and the taste of last night's coffee from Joe's lingered in his throat, bitter as his thoughts. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The stubble on his cheeks was thicker, his eyes were redder, and his face seemed older, as if he had lived an entire life in 2 days. The house he had shared with Emily now felt alien, like a museum to their broken marriage. After that scene in the bedroom, he had packed a bag of clothes and driven away, leaving her alone. They hadn't spoken since, and Mark wasn't sure if he wanted to see her at all. Emily had called a few times, left messages, but he hadn't listened to them. Every word she said seemed like another lie he wasn't ready to swallow. He started the car and drove to his parents' house on the other side of Pineville, in a quiet neighborhood where old maple trees cast long shadows on the sidewalks. He needed support, someone to tell him he wasn't alone, that his world hadn't completely fallen apart. His parents, Bob and Marge, were simple people. His father fixed cars in his shop, his mother baked pies for church fairs. They had always been his rock, but today, as Mark pulled up to their house, he felt a sense of foreboding in his heart. He knocked on the door, and Marge opened it almost immediately, her face lighting up with a smile that quickly faded when she saw him. "Mark, son, what are you doing here so early?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron, which smelled of cinnamon and flour. "Just dropping by," he said, trying to sound casual, but his voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't slept in days. He walked into the living room, which smelled of old furniture and coffee. Bob was sitting in his chair, leafing through the local newspaper, but when he saw Mark, he put it down and took off his glasses. "What's wrong, son?" he asked, his voice calm but his eyes flickering with worry. Mark sat down on the couch, feeling the springs creak under his weight. He didn't know where to begin, but the words just came out. "Emily and Steve," he said, looking at the floor. "I caught them in our bedroom yesterday." Silence hung in the room, heavy as a wet blanket. Marge froze, her hands still clutching her apron, and Bob coughed, rubbing his chin. "Oh, Mark," Marge finally said, her voice soft but somewhat evasive, as if she were afraid to say too much. "You knew?" Mark asked, looking up at his father. His voice was sharp as a blade. "You both knew?" Bob looked away, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. "Son, we didn't know for sure. There were rumors, but you know how it is in Pineville, people will talk about anything." "Rumors?" Mark felt the anger he'd been trying to keep at bay begin to bubble up. "What rumors, Dad? What did you hear? That Emily was sleeping with my best friend, and you didn't tell me?" Marge took a step toward him, her hand reaching for his shoulder, but he pulled away. "Mark, we didn't mean to interfere," she said, her voice shaking. "This is between you and Emily. We thought maybe it was just gossip. You know how people like to exaggerate." "Exaggerate?" Mark stood up, his fists clenched. "I caught them in our bedroom, Mom, on our bed. This isn't gossip, it's the truth. And you knew and kept quiet." Bob raised his hand, as if trying to calm him down. "Mark, calm down. We didn't know for sure. People were saying that Steve was coming over a lot, that he and Emily were getting too close. But we didn't think it was serious. We didn't want to interfere in your marriage." Mark looked at them, at their guilty faces, and felt something inside him break. His parents, the people he trusted most, knew about the rumors and kept quiet. They chose to stay out of it, leaving him in the dark, like a fool who is the last to know that his life is a joke. "Thank you for your support," he said quietly, his voice cold as the winter wind. He turned and walked out, not listening to Marge calling his name. Out on the street, he climbed into his truck and gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He didn't know where to go, but the thought of going back to the house where Emily still lived was unbearable. He decided to go to Dan, his childhood friend, whom he hadn't seen in months. Dan was the only one Mark hoped would be honest with him. They had grown up together, ridden bikes together, gotten into trouble together. Dan was the one who always told the truth, even when it hurt. Dan lived in a small house by the railroad tracks, where the smell of creosote mingled with the scent of freshly cut grass. When Mark knocked, Dan answered the door holding a bottle of beer. A smile lit up his face, but it quickly faded when he saw Mark's expression. "Damn, Mark, you look like you've been run over by a truck," he said, stepping aside to let Mark through. Mark walked in, the smell of beer and old wood enveloping him. He sat down on the couch that was older than their friendship and looked at Dan. "You knew?" he asked without preamble, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Dan froze, his hand holding the bottle halfway to his mouth. "Knew what?" he asked, but his eyes gave him away. They were filled with the same awkwardness Mark had seen in Mrs. Carter and Joe. "About Emily and Steve," Mark said, looking him straight in the eye. "You knew they were, that they were together, that the whole town knew except me?" Dan set the bottle down on the table, his fingers drumming nervously on the cap. "Mark, look, I heard some stuff, but it was just rumors, you know. I didn't think it was true. People in Pineville talk about anything." "Just rumors?" Mark felt anger flare in his chest like a spark in dry grass. "I caught them in our bedroom, Dan. Yesterday. It's not a rumor. It's real. And you knew, and you didn't tell me." Dan looked away, his face flushed. "I didn't mean to interfere, Mark. This is your family, your life. I thought, maybe it didn't mean anything. Maybe it was just talk." "Talking?" Mark stood up, his voice shaking with rage. "My wife slept with my best friend, and you call that talking? You were my friend, Dan. You should have told me." "I didn't know how." Dan raised his voice too, his eyes finally meeting Mark's. "What was I supposed to do? Run up to you and say, 'Hey, I heard Emily and Steve are hanging out too much. Would you believe me? Or would you say I was meddling?" Mark was silent, his breathing heavy, as if he'd run a mile. He wanted to shout, to argue, but the truth was, Dan was right, he wouldn't believe it. He would have brushed it off and said it was impossible. But now that he knew the truth, Dan's silence was like another stab in the back. "Forget it," Mark said, heading for the door. "Thanks for your friendship." He walked out without looking back, feeling his world shrinking, as if Pineville were squeezing him in its tight embrace. It was an even worse day at the factory where Mark fixed computers. He sat at his desk, surrounded by old monitors and the smell of overheated electronics, but he couldn't get any work done. His co-workers, Tina and Paul, were whispering behind the partition, their voices low but loud enough for him to hear snatches of what they were saying. "Poor guy, I told you Steve was a creep," Paul muttered. Tina said something back, but Mark couldn't make out the words, only her tone, a mixture of pity and curiosity, as if his life were a soap opera. He stood up to get a coffee from the machine and noticed Tina quickly turned away, pretending to be busy with paperwork. Paul cleared his throat and looked down at his computer, but Mark could see his eyes following him. "Hey, Mark, are you okay?" Paul asked, but his voice was too cheerful, as if he was trying to hide his awkwardness. "Yes," Mark answered, not looking at him. He picked up his coffee and walked back to his desk, feeling the eyes of his colleagues burning into his back. They knew, they all knew, and their pity was worse than their silence. He felt like a caged animal being shown to onlookers at a zoo. By the end of the day, Mark was on edge. He left work early without a word and drove around town, trying to find one place where he wouldn't feel betrayed. But Pineville was too small, too crowded. Every house, every street, reminded him of the past of neighborhood barbecues where Emily and Steve laughed a little too loudly, of nights at Joe's where people looked at each other when he walked in. He stopped at the old bridge over the river where he'd looked at his reflection the day before. The water was as murky as his thoughts. He didn't go home. The house he'd shared with Emily felt strange now, filled with the ghosts of their past lives. He knew she was there. Her car had been parked outside when he'd driven by that morning, but he couldn't bring himself to go in. Instead, he drove to his parents' house, hoping to sleep in his old room, but after talking to them, even their house felt like a cage. He went back to the truck, parked it by the river, and sat there, listening to the water ripple in the dark. Mark felt the humiliation and betrayal wash over him like fog over a river. His parents, his friends, his co-workers, they all knew his life was falling apart, and no one had said a word. The Pineville he loved, the place he called home, was a nest of lies, where everyone smiled in his face but whispered behind his back. He gripped the steering wheel, his fingers shaking, and in that moment he knew he couldn't just go on living. He wouldn't be a victim, laughed at by the entire town. He would find a way to make them all pay, not with his fists, not with his screams, but with something far more devastating. By Tuesday night, Pineville was drowning in the twilight that fell over the town like a heavy curtain, hiding its secrets beneath the cover of darkness. Mark sat in his truck, parked by the river, where the water lapped lazily against the rocks, reflecting the dim light of the street lamps. He had not gone back to the house he had once shared with Emily, the same house where the scent of her perfume still clung to the walls and the rumpled sheets in the bedroom were a silent reproach to his blindness. He had taken a bag of clothes after an argument and was now sleeping in the truck or in his parents' old room, but even their house, smelling of pie and old wood, felt foreign to him. Emily called and left messages, but he deleted them without reading them, her voice an echo of the lies he had caught in their bedroom. Pineville, his hometown, had become a labyrinth of hypocrisy, where every look, every word was steeped in knowledge that he alone did not share. Mark felt the humiliation that had been building since he'd found Emily and Steve squeeze his chest like a tightrope. His parents, Dan, his co-workers, they all knew, and their silence was worse than betrayal. He started the car and drove to the only place he could drown out the noise in his head, the Rusty Nail, a bar on the outskirts of Pineville. It was a seedy dive that smelled of cheap beer and sweat, and its neon sign flickered like a dying firefly. The local drunks and truckers gathered there to drown their sorrows in whiskey and talk, and Mark decided that tonight he would be one of them. The rusty nail was stuffy inside, despite the open windows. The bar, darkened with age, glistened with spilled beer, and an old jukebox hummed in the corner, pumping out a raucous country tune. Mark sat at the bar, away from a group of truckers arguing loudly about gas prices. The bartender, a skinny guy named Roy with a tattoo of a snake on his neck, nodded at him. "What do you want, Mark?" he asked, wiping his glass with a greasy towel. "Bourbon. Extra," Mark replied, his voice rough as gravel under tires. Roy didn't ask questions, just poured a double shot into the cloudy glass and slid it toward Mark. The liquid burned his throat, but the warmth that spread through his chest was better than the cold emptiness that had settled in there since the night before. He drank the first glass in one gulp, feeling the alcohol dull the pain but not make it go away. He drank the second glass more slowly, looking at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. The man looking back at him was a stranger, with dark circles under his eyes, his lips pressed together, his eyes filled with fury. He remembered Mrs. Carter's awkward smiles, Dan's evasive words, the whispers of his coworkers behind the partition. They all knew his wife was sleeping with his best friend, and no one said a word to him. Pineville, his home, his refuge, was a nest of vipers where everyone smiled to his face but laughed behind his back. On the third glass of bourbon, old Larry, a retired mechanic who was now living on retirement and telling stories about his youth, walked into the bar. Larry was one of those guys who knew everything about everyone in Pineville, and his tongue loosened after a couple of pints. He plopped down on a stool next to Mark, ordered a beer, and turned to him. "Hey, Mark, you look like you lost your dog," he said, grinning. His teeth were yellow as old parchment, and his eyes were bright with beer and curiosity. "Not a dog," Mark muttered, looking into his glass. The bourbon was making his head spin, and the words came out easier than he expected. "A wife and a friend in the same bedroom." Larry whistled, his eyebrows rising. "Man, that's tough. I heard Steve was hanging around your place a lot, but I thought it was just talk. Pineville got away with its mouths." Mark froze, his fingers gripping the glass so tightly it almost cracked. "You heard? And what? The whole town was talking about it, and no one told me?" Larry shrugged, taking a sip of beer. "Well, no one wants to pry into other people's business. People have seen Steve stopping by your place, him and Emily whispering at school meetings. But who's going to come to you with that? They'll just say it's gossip." "No one wants to meddle in someone else's business," Mark repeated, his voice low, almost growling. He finished his bourbon and gestured for another. The alcohol was bubbling in his veins like fire, burning away the last remnants of his patience. "They didn't meddle, but they talked. Behind my back. All these years." Larry leaned closer, his breath smelling of beer and tobacco. "Look, Mark, Pineville is like a swamp. Everybody sees everything, but nobody talks. You're not the first one who's been duped. Remember John from the farm? His wife ran off with the mailman, and he found out when the whole town was already whispering." Mark looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "So what? Am I supposed to live with this? Pretend everything's okay while they all laugh?" Larry chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Live your life, kid. But if you're a victim, they'll eat you alive. Pineville loves weaklings." The words hit Mark like a slap in the face. Victim. The word stuck in his head like a rusty nail. He wasn't a victim. He wouldn't be a victim. He finished his fourth drink, feeling the world around him begin to blur, as if he were looking at Pineville through a glass that was clouded. His thoughts were jumbled, but one idea was becoming clear. He wasn't going to let this town, these people who knew and said nothing, make a mockery of him. "I'm not a victim," he muttered, looking into his empty glass. Roy raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, just poured himself more bourbon. Mark drank, and in that moment, like lightning in the night sky, a revelation struck him. Emily and Steve were to blame, but they weren't the only ones. All these people, Mrs. Carter, Dan, his parents, his co-workers, Even that old man Larry they had all stood by while his life was falling apart. They were all complicit in their own way, and if they thought he would just swallow the humiliation, they were wrong. "I'll make them regret it," he said quietly, but there was a steely ring in his voice. Larry looked at him, his smirk fading. "What are you talking about, kid?" he asked, but Mark didn't answer. His thoughts, steeped in bourbon, began to form a plan not impulsive, not chaotic, but cold and calculated, like a chess game. He knew Pineville, he knew its weaknesses. He knew how the town lived on rumors, how they spread through Joe, through church fairs, through local town talk forums, where anonymous messages can tear a reputation to shreds. "They all knew," Mark said, his voice firm now despite the alcohol. "And they'll all pay." Larry shook his head, finishing his beer. "Careful, Mark. Pineville is small, but it has long arms. If you start a war, be prepared to face the consequences." Mark didn't answer. He tossed a few crumpled bills onto the bar and stood up, swaying. The world was spinning, but his determination was like an anchor, keeping him afloat. He walked out of the bar, feeling the cold night air hit his face, but it didn't sober him up. In fact, his drunken stupor only increased his rage. He got into the truck, but didn't start the engine. Instead, he leaned back in the seat, looking up at the dark sky, where the stars were hidden behind clouds. His mind was racing, but now it had a purpose. He remembered fixing computers at the factory, seeing other people's files, conversations, photos they hadn't bothered to delete. He knew Pineville had secrets not just his. The mayor who boasted of his honesty but had suspicious accounts. The neighbors who smiled at barbecues but his debts and infidelities. Even Mrs. Carter, who seemed so kind, had once whispered about someone's divorce with such glee that Mark had been surprised. They were all vulnerable, and he knew how to exploit it. Revenge wouldn't be with his fists nostalgic, wasn't that stupid. He wouldn't start a bar fight or burn down someone's house. No, his revenge would be subtler, deeper, like a knife that goes in unnoticed. He would use their own weapons, the rumors, the secrets, the truths they'd worked so hard to hide. Town Talk, that anonymous forum where Pineville residents discussed everything from gas prices to other people's romances, would be his tool. He knew how to keep the people behind the posts from being discovered. His computer skills had saved the plant more than once, and now they would save him. Mark closed his eyes, feeling the alcohol and the anger merge into something new, a determination that was like cold fire. He would not be a victim. He would make Pineville pay for its silence, for its hypocrisy. And he would start with those who had hurt him the most, Emily and Steve. But they would not be the only ones. Everyone who knew and kept silent would feel his wrath. He started the engine and drove to his parents' house, where he planned to spend the night, because he couldn't go back to Emily's house. The night was as dark as his thoughts, but in that darkness, a plan was being born that would change everything. Pineville didn't yet know who he was dealing with. The rain finally fell on Pineville, turning the dusty streets into muddy streams that flowed toward the river, carrying with them small debris and the town's illusions of innocence. Mark sat in his office at the plant, surrounded by the hum of old computers and the smell of overheated electronics, but his mind was far from work. He did not return to the house he had once shared with Emily, the house where every room was soaked with her betrayal. He slept in a pickup truck parked by the river, or in a cramped room at his parents', where the bed creaked like his nerves. Emily kept calling, her messages piling up on his phone, but he did not open them, not wanting to hear another lie. Pineville, his hometown, had become a minefield where every step threatened another explosion of humiliation. But now, after a drunken night at the Rusty Nail, a purpose had been born inside him, cold as steel and sharp as a blade. He would not be a victim. He would make them all pay, starting with Emily and Steve, but not ending with them. Mark knew that impulsive revenge, the yelling, the fighting, the crying, was the way of the weak. He wanted something more, something that would tear their lives apart the way they had torn his. His job as a computer technician at a factory had given him skills he'd never thought he'd use like this. The people of Pineville were careless. They left passwords on sticky notes, didn't delete conversations, didn't clear their browser histories. Mark had seen it for years. fixing their laptops, phones, tablets. Now that knowledge was his weapon. He started with Emily. Her laptop, an old Dell he'd upgraded himself 2 years ago, was still at home. Mark waited until late at night. When he knew she'd be at a school assembly, she'd mentioned it in one of the messages he'd glimpsed before deleting. When he pulled up to her house, he noticed her car was missing, the windows dark. His heart sank as he inserted the key into the lock, but he pushed the feeling down. This wasn't his house, not anymore. This was a crime scene where he'd find evidence. The inside smelled of her perfume, the same floral scent he'd once loved. He walked into the living room, where her laptop sat on the table, next to a half-finished cup of tea. He turned it on and felt the anger return, but it was cool, controlled. The password, their wedding date, still worked, and that was another blow. She hadn't bothered to change it. The screen lit up, revealing a folder of documents and a browser full of tabs. Mark started with email. At first, he found nothing special: school newsletters, letters from parents, lesson plans. But in the folder labeled Archive, he noticed a chain of emails from Steve, dating back 3 years. His fingers paused over the keyboard as he opened the first. "Hey, Em, thanks for yesterday. You were right, that restaurant in the next town was a gem. No one knows us there. Next, I can't stop thinking about you. When is Mark leaving for the graveyard shift again?" Mark's breathing grew heavy as he read, as if the air in the room had thickened. The emails were full of innuendo, jokes, and intimate details. They'd met at a motel outside of town, in a park after dark, even in the school library after school. The affair had lasted not weeks, not months, but years. For years, they'd lied to him, hiding behind his back while he fixed computers and dreamed of a future with Emily. He found the photos Steve had sent her, the two of them at a cafe outside of town, her face laughing against the sunset, their hands intertwined under a table. One of the emails was a scan of a receipt from a jewelry store. Steve had given her a bracelet, the one Emily had called a gift from her sister. Mark remembered her fiddling with it on her wrist, smiling when he asked where it was from. The lies were everywhere, woven into their lives like poisonous threads. He copied everything onto the flash drive he always carried with him for work. His hands were shaking, but not with anger, with determination. This wasn't just an affair, this was a life they'd been living behind his back. But he didn't stop there. He found Emily's browsing history in her browser, the motel website where they'd met, the Town Talk forum where she'd read anonymous posts about local gossip. One post from last year read, "Someone saw a familiar car outside the house on Oak Street. Is this happening again?" The comments underneath were full of innuendo, and Mark knew it was about them. Pineville knew, and he kept quiet. His next move was Steve. Steve's store, Harris and Sons, was closed at night, but Mark knew he often left his old computer in the back room. He and Emily sometimes joked that Steve kept everything from bills to personal notes there. Mark parked around the corner to avoid being seen and entered through the back door, which Steve never locked, another carelessness Mark now exploited. The back room smelled of paint and dust, and the old computer hummed like a tired beast. The password, Pville985, the year the store was founded, was as obvious as Emily's. On Steve's computer, he found more than he expected. Emails from Emily, saved in a folder innocently titled Business Emails, revealed details of their meetings, dates, locations, even jokes about how easy it was to fool Mark. "He's too busy with his computers to notice," Steve wrote in one message. Mark felt his face heat up, but he continued. He found receipts for a motel, for wine, for the bracelet. There were other files, too. Photos of them hugging in the car, tickets for a trip to a nearby town where, Mark now realized, they'd spent the weekend while he thought Emily was at her sister's. But then he stumbled upon something unexpected. The other folder contained documents unrelated to Emily, invoices for supplies to the store that looked suspiciously inflated, emails with a supplier in which Steve negotiated an extra discount in exchange for cash. Mark knew enough about accounting to know that this wasn't just a business, it was a scam. Steve was profiting from his store by defrauding customers and suppliers. This was dirt that could ruin his reputation in Pineville. Mark copied everything, his fingers moving quickly but methodically. He felt like a hunter who had found the scent of an animal, but he didn't stop there. His job at the plant had given him access to the computers of his coworkers, his neighbors, even the mayor, which he repaired on request. He remembered once restoring data for Mrs. Carter, a neighbor who knew about the affair but kept quiet. Then he noticed a folder of emails in which she had discussed her husband's debt with a friend, a debt no one in town was supposed to know about. He remembered fixing the laptop of Tina, a coworker who had whispered behind his back. Her correspondence contained messages about an affair with a married man in the next town over. Even the mayor, whose computer Mark had updated last month, had left traces, emails hinting at bribes for construction contracts. He hadn't been looking for these secrets, but now that his eyes were open, he saw them everywhere. Pineville was full of lies, and Mark, a technician who knew where to look, could bring the dirt to light. He saved everything he found to his flash drive, creating folders with names like Emily, Steve, Carter, Tina, and the mayor. His heart beat steadily, despite the adrenaline. It wasn't anger, but a cold determination, like an engineer building a machine of destruction. By the time he finished, night had fallen over Pineville. He sat in his pickup, parked next to an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town where no one could see him. The rain pounded the roof, creating a rhythm that calmed him. He looked at the flash drive in his hand, so small and yet so heavy. It held the truth not just about Emily and Steve, but about the town that had laughed at him behind his back. He knew this was just the beginning. Town Talk, the anonymous forum where Pineville residents shared gossip, would be his weapon. He could post anything, letters, photos, receipts, and no one would know who did it. His skills allowed him to cover his tracks, like he had done at the plant, recovering deleted files. Mark didn't want to rush. His revenge wouldn't be a flash of anger, but a slow fire that would burn away everything Pineville had hidden. He would start with Emily and Steve, but he wouldn't stop there. Everyone who knew and kept quiet would feel his wrath. He wouldn't be a victim. He would be a judge, and Pineville would learn what it was like to pay for his secrets. The fog settled over Pineville, covering the town like a shroud, hiding its dirty secrets beneath a gray haze. Mark sat in his old room at his parents', where the smell of dust and old books mingled with the aroma of his mother's pies wafting from the kitchen. He didn't go back to the house he'd shared with Emily, which was now an open wound filled with memories of her betrayal. He slept either in the truck parked by the river, where the cold chilled his bones, or here in the room where his high school diplomas still hung, reminders of a time when life had seemed simpler. Emily kept calling, her messages piling up on his phone, but he didn't read them, not wanting to hear her voice, which now meant nothing but lies. His world had narrowed to one goal: revenge, cold and calculating, like the software he'd written in the factory, tweaking the code until it was perfect. The flash drive on his desk was his arsenal. It held evidence: Emily and Steve's text messages, photos of their secret meetings, motel receipts, the bracelet she lied about getting from her sister, and even dirt on other Pineville residents, Mrs. Carter, Tina, the mayor. But Mark decided to start small, with the people who had hurt him the most. Emily and Steve would be the first, but their downfall would only be the beginning. He knew Pineville was alive with rumors, and his weapon, the anonymous Town Talk forum, was the perfect tool to start a fire no one could put out. He started with Emily. Among the files copied from her laptop were photos Steve had emailed her. Her in a motel outside of town, wearing a thin nightgown, laughing, a glass of wine in her hand. The images were intimate, not explicit, but personal enough to ruin her reputation in the eyes of Pineville, where an elementary school teacher was supposed to be a moral paragon. Mark connected to the Wi-Fi at Joe's, using an old laptop he kept for work so no one could track him. He created an anonymous Town Talk account called Truth Seeker and uploaded the photos, adding a short post: Teacher of the Year or something else. Check out Emily's nights. He didn't mention Steve yet, that was just the opening blow. As he pressed publish, he felt his heart begin to pound, not from fear, but from a strange, almost painful excitement. This was the beginning, his first step into an abyss from which there was no return. He closed his laptop and walked out of the cafe, not looking at Joe, who, as always, was polishing the counter with a forced smile. The fog outside grew thicker, and Mark disappeared into it, like a ghost that Pineville had not yet known. By the next morning, the Town Talk forum had exploded. Mark checked it on his phone, sitting in his truck by the river. The post had dozens of comments. "Is this really Emily? Oh my God, that's disgusting," wrote someone named FarmGirl22. "Always knew she wasn't such a saint," added Old Timer. There were those who defended her. "It's photoshopped, don't believe it." But they were few. Pineville, hungry for gossip, was already tearing her reputation apart. Mark felt a twinge of satisfaction, but it was mixed with something else, a shadow of fear, as if he'd started a machine he couldn't stop. His next move was on Steve. Among the files he found on Steve's computer were evidence of his fraud at Harris and Sons. Inflated billing, correspondence with a supplier about cash discounts, forged receipts, all of it could ruin his business. Steve not only sponsored school events, but also supplied materials for local construction projects, and his reputation for honesty was his greatest asset. Mark knew that a blow to that reputation would be fatal. He composed an anonymous letter using a temporary email address created through a secure service. He attached scanned documents and sent them to the manager of the construction company Steve worked with most often, as well as to the local tax office. "Are you sure you want to deal with this supplier?" he wrote, adding enough detail that no one would doubt its authenticity. He sent the letter late at night, sitting in his parents' room, while the rain pounded the windows like a metronome, counting down his revenge. 2 days later, rumors about Steve began to spread. Mark heard about it at Joe's, where he now avoided the counter, preferring a table in the corner. Bill, the farmer, was loudly discussing with Linda, the supermarket cashier. "I heard Steve got fired from the building supply business. They say he was stealing from customers." Linda nodded, her eyes shining with curiosity. "And they say his store is being audited by the IRS. He's finished." Mark took a sip of coffee, hiding his face behind the mug. Satisfaction was as hot as the drink in his hands, but fear, like a cold wind, was creeping under his skin. What if he was found out? What if someone figured it out? By the end of the week, Steve was out of a job. His store, usually full of customers, was now half empty, and the sign for Harris and Sons looked dim, as if the town itself had turned its back on him. Mark saw him one day as he drove past. Steve standing at the entrance, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn, like a man who had lost everything. Mark felt no pity, only a dark, almost animal pleasure that his plan had worked. But Emily was more complicated. Her photos on Town Talk had caused a storm. The school where she worked was buzzing with talk of her inappropriate behavior. Parents were demanding an explanation, and rumor had it that the principal had called her in for a chat. Mark learned of this from Tina, a colleague who couldn't resist sharing the gossip during lunch. "They say Emily might get fired," she said, her voice full of mock pity. "It's a shame, isn't it?" Mark nodded, not looking up from his sandwich, but inside he felt satisfaction battling with fear. He had ruined her reputation, but every comment on the forum, every whisper in the cafeteria, reminded him that he was playing with fire. He sat in the truck that night, parked outside an abandoned barn where the rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with damp. The flash drive had been in his pocket like a talisman, but now it felt like a bomb, ready to go off at any moment. He thought about what he'd done, the photos of Emily, the dirt on Steve, the lives he'd ruined. The satisfaction was sweet as the first sip of bourbon, but the fear was bitter as its aftertaste. What if someone found out? What if Pineville turned on him? He knew the town was unforgiving of those who broke its rules. But it was too late to back out. He had started this war, and now he had to see it through. Emily and Steve had been the first, but there was more on his flash drive secrets from Mrs. Carter, Tina, the mayor. Pineville held so much dirt that Mark could drown him in it. He started the engine, his hands shaking, but not from the cold. This was the beginning, and he knew his revenge was only gaining momentum. Pineville awoke to a buzz of gossip that blew through the narrow streets like the wind before a storm, invading every home, every cafe, every shop. The scandal Mark had started had grown like a weed in the fertile soil of the town's curiosity. The Town Talk forum was ablaze with anonymous posts. Emily's photos, her intimate moments posted under the handle Truth Seeker, fueled the gossip, and rumors of Steve's dealings at Harris and Sons had reached every corner of Pineville. People whispered in Joe's, at the supermarket checkout, in the church pews, exchanging stories that grew more bizarre with each retelling. Mark, sitting in his pickup truck parked next to an old barn on the outskirts, felt the town shake under his blows, but the feeling was not only triumphant, it was poisoned by the fear that followed him like a shadow. He never returned to the house he had once shared with Emily. That house, where the scent of her perfume still clung to the curtains, felt like a tomb of their past. He slept in the truck, where the cold was chilling, or in the cramped room of his parents' house, where old charters on the walls reminded him of a time when he still believed in the honesty of people. Emily called, her messages piling up, but he did not open them, afraid that her voice would shatter the fragile resolve he had built. Pineville, his hometown, had become an arena where he was both hunter and hunted. His revenge, begun with Emily's photos and the dirt on Steve, had been a machine, but now he felt it picking up speed he might not be able to control. At the factory where Mark fixed computers, the air was thick with unspoken words. His co-workers, Tina and Paul, no longer whispered behind his back. They fell silent when he walked into a room, their eyes wary, as if he were not a person but a ghost best left alone. Even Mr. Hayes, his boss, who usually joked about his coffee breaks, now gave short nods and looked away, as if he were afraid Mark would read his mind. At Joe's, customers sat back when he entered, and Joe, polishing the counter, talked only about the weather, avoiding his eyes. Pineville knew someone was starting this fire, and although no one said it out loud, Mark could feel their fear enveloping him like smoke. On Friday morning, he stopped at the supermarket for a water and a sandwich, but the line at the checkout stalled when he arrived. Linda, the cashier who always chatted to him about the news, now punched in her check in silence, her fingers shaking as if she were afraid he might pull another secret out of his pocket. Old Bill, standing behind her, muttered something about the price of bread and walked away quickly, not looking Mark in the eye. Mrs. Carter, whom he had spotted at the canned goods counter, turned and walked down another aisle, her cart creaking as if in sync with her haste. They were afraid of him, not because they knew it was him, but because they sensed that someone was pricking the pustules of Pineville and that someone would not stop. Mark got back in the truck, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the empty street. The satisfaction of Emily and Steve's downfall still warmed him like coals in a fire, but the fear that he'd gone too far was beginning to smolder in his chest. Town Talk was still seething, with new posts discussing Emily's suspension. The parents of students had filed a complaint with the school board, demanding she be fired. Steve, with his contracts and reputation gone, had closed the store for temporary repairs, but rumors said the IRS audit would drag on for months. Mark could see his plan working, but every new comment on the forum, every evasive smile in town, reminded him that he was teetering on the edge of an abyss. Later that evening, as Mark sat in his parents' room, sorting through yet another folder on a flash drive this time, it was documents about Mrs. Carter's debts, there was a knock on the door. His mother, Marge, peered out from the kitchen, her face tense. "Mark, there's Emily," she said quietly, as if she were afraid her words would blow up the house. Mark froze, his fingers tightening around the flash drive. He hadn't seen Emily since that night in the bedroom, and the thought of her presence was like a punch to the gut. He walked downstairs, his heart pounding, but not with love, with a mixture of anger and fear. Emily was standing on the porch, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, her face drawn, as if she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes, once so bright, were now red from crying, but there was a spark of rage in them that Mark hadn't seen before. "Mark, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She took a step forward, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "Speak here," he said, his voice cold as steel. He didn't want her in his parents' house, didn't want her presence defiling another place. Emily clenched her fists, her lip trembling. "You have to stop," she said, her eyes darting over his face as if searching for the mark she knew. "Those pictures, on Town Talk. I know it's you. You're destroying me, Mark. I got fired. My students' parents are calling me a loose woman. I can't go outside without people whispering. Is that you?" Mark was silent, his face set in stone, but inside he felt fear and satisfaction fighting like two beasts. He hadn't expected her to come, hadn't expected her to figure it out. "You destroyed yourself," he finally said, his voice low, almost a growl. "You and Steve. For years, Emily. For years you lied to me, and the whole town knew." Her eyes widened, tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't back down. "You think this is revenge? You think this will fix anything? You're ruining my life, Mark, and Steve's. His shop is closed. He's been kicked out of all contracts. You want to destroy us, but it won't bring you back. Do you think I want something in return?" Mark stepped closer to her, his voice getting louder, but he was still holding back. "You slept with my best friend, Emily, in our house, on our bed, and Pineville watched and stayed silent. You all made a fool out of me. Now you know how it feels." Emily shook her head, her voice breaking. "You've gone too far, Mark. I could sue. For defamation, for invasion of privacy. Those photos, they're illegal. Stop before it gets worse." Her words were like cold water on his anger. Judgment. He hadn't thought about it, hadn't thought about the consequences. His revenge was precise, anonymous, but if Emily figured it out, if someone linked him to Truth Seeker, everything could fall apart. He felt the fear in his throat, but he didn't show it. "Try it," he said, his voice steady but shaking inside. "We'll see who wins when the whole town finds out what you did." Emily looked at him, her eyes full of pain and rage. "You're not the man I loved," she said quietly, almost in a whisper. "You've become a monster." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the silence until the fog swallowed her figure. Mark closed the door, his hands shaking. He walked back into the room, where the flash drive lay on the table like a mine ready to explode. He knew Emily was right, he had gone too far. His revenge, begun with the photos and the dirt, was now threatening to consume him. Pineville was abuzz with scandal. People were afraid of him, but the fear was mutual. He was afraid of being found out, of his life, already ruined, getting worse. But he couldn't stop. Not when he could see his blows landing. Emily and Steve had been the first, but there were other names on his flash drive: Mrs. Carter, Tina, the mayor. Pineville was going to learn what it was like to pay for silence. He sat down on the bed, feeling the room close in around him. The satisfaction of Emily and Steve's fall still simmered in his chest, but the fear was stronger. He knew that his revenge was playing with fire, and that fire could burn him. Pineville was shaking under the unseen blow, like an old house whose walls are creaking under a wind that threatens to blow the roof off. The rumors Mark had started had grown like mold, infiltrating every corner of town, from Joe's to the churchyard, where the old ladies who usually whispered about the price of apples now discussed the sins of others with a greedy glint in their eyes. The Town Talk forum had become the epicenter of the storm. Anonymous posts under the handle Truth Seeker multiplied, each blow more accurate than the last, and Pineville, accustomed to gossip, was now suffocating under it. Mark, sitting in his pickup truck parked near an abandoned sawmill on the edge of town, watched the screen of his phone as the forum comments multiplied like insects. His revenge, which had begun with Emily and Steve, now encompassed the entire town, but instead of triumph, he felt an emptiness growing inside him, cold and bottomless, like a well. He never returned to the house he once shared with Emily. That house was now a Pandora's box, full of the ghosts of their past, saturated with her betrayal. He slept in the truck, where the smell of gasoline and old leather was his only solace, or in his parents' room, where old photographs adorned the walls, reminding him of a life that no longer existed. Emily had stopped calling after their last meeting, when she had threatened to sue, but her words, "You've become a monster," still echoed in his head, impossible to silence. Pineville, his hometown, had become a battleground where he was the puppet master, pulling the strings of secrets, but each victory left him more alone. Mark was determined not to stop. Emily and Steve were just the beginning, the first victims whose lives he had destroyed with cold precision. But Pineville was full of those who knew about their affair and kept quiet, laughing behind his back. Mrs. Carter, whose awkward glances betrayed her knowledge. Tina, whose whispers at the plant were like a knife in the back. Even the mayor, whose virtuous mask hid dirty deals. They all deserved what Emily and Steve had gotten, and Mark, with his flash drive full of dirt, was ready to pay off the debts. He started with Mrs. Carter, a neighbor whose good-natured smile now seemed like a mask of hypocrisy. Among the files he found while fixing her laptop were emails in which she discussed her husband's debt, tens of thousands of dollars hidden from neighbors behind the facade of a perfect family. Mark created a new post on Town Talk. Who would have thought that upstanding Mrs. Carter would hide such secrets? Ask her husband about her bank account. He attached a scan of the letter from the creditor, disguising it so that no one could trace the source. The post exploded with comments. "Is this true? The Carters are in debt," wrote someone named Pineville. "Always knew they weren't what they seemed," added another. By evening, Mrs. Carter had stopped showing up on the porch, her curtains were drawn, and her terrier tapped in the empty yard. Next up was Tina, a co-worker at the plant whose pity was worse than her whispers. Mark had found her correspondence with a married man in the next town over, messages full of innuendo and plans to meet. He posted screenshots on Town Talk with the headline, "Who else at the plant plays love at someone else's expense?" The reaction was immediate. Coworkers who had already avoided Mark now looked at Tina with the same wary curiosity she had once directed at him. Tina stopped showing up in the lunchroom, her face flushed with shame as she passed Mark. But he felt no pity, only a cold satisfaction, like a job well done. The mayor was more complicated. His dirt letters alleging bribes for construction contracts demanded caution. Mark sent the documents anonymously to the local paper with a short note. "Pineville deserves to know who runs it." The paper, which usually reported on fairs and high school games, ran a story with the headline, "Questions for the Mayor, Truth or Slander?" The town buzzed like a disturbed beehive. At the next town hall meeting, residents asked questions, their voices shaking with anger and fear. The usually confident mayor mumbled, rubbing his forehead like a man caught in the act. Pineville became a tangled mess of paranoia. Neighbors stopped saying hello, afraid their secrets would be next. At Joe's, conversations died down when someone walked in, and everyone glanced at each other as if anyone could be a truth seeker. The Town Talk forum became a place for people to blame each other, finding enemies among friends. "Who's next?" someone named Scared Citizen wrote. "It's a witch hunt," another responded. Mark read it from the back of his truck, his lips twitching into a smile that was as empty as an autumn field. He relished the power. Every new post, every new rumor, was like a hammer blow, smashing the facade of Pineville. He watched Mrs. Carter cower in her house. Tina avoided his gaze. The mayor lost his luster. He felt like a god, dishing out justice, doling out punishment to those who had laughed at him. But the feeling was fleeting like smoke. Every night, lying in his truck or on his parents' creaky bed, he stared at the ceiling, the emptiness growing inside him. His vengeance had destroyed others, but it hadn't filled the hole Emily and Steve had left. He could still hear her words, "You've become a monster," and wonder if she was right. One night, as he sat in Joe's, hiding behind his old laptop, Larry, the old man from the Rusty Nail, sat down next to him, his eyes bright with beer and curiosity. "Have you heard what's going on, Mark?" he asked, his voice rough as gravel. "The town's going crazy. Everyone's afraid of their dirty laundry being aired on Town Talk." Mark took a sip of coffee, trying not to give himself away. "People get what they deserve," he said quietly, his eyes glued to the screen. Larry chuckled, taking a sip of beer. "Maybe so, but you know, kid, when you're tearing up other people's lives, your own is going to crack too. Be careful, or this fire will burn you too." Mark looked at him, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Larry didn't know he was truth seeker, but his words were like a mirror, showing Mark what he was afraid to admit. He nodded without answering, and Larry walked away, leaving him alone with his laptop and his thoughts. Pineville was falling apart, and Mark was the reason for it, but every new post, every new secret he brought to light, left him emptier. He enjoyed the power, but it was like poison, sweet to the taste, but deadly. He got back in the truck, parked it by the river, where the dark water reflected the stars, which seemed to stare back at him accusingly. The flash drive in his pocket felt like a stone, dragging him down. He knew he couldn't stop not with Pineville on its knees, but the emptiness inside him was growing, and he was afraid that if he destroyed the town, he would lose what little was left of himself. Winter had come to Pineville like a thief stealing the last of autumn's colors. The snow fell slowly, blanketing the town in a thin white that hid the dirt of the streets, but did nothing to hide its wounds. Pineville, once a cozy, close-knit community, was now a broken mirror, each shard reflecting someone's shameful fall. Rumors started by Mark, under the handle Truth Seeker, had turned the town into a battleground where no one trusted anyone. Joe's was deserted, the church pews were half empty, and the town talk forums that had once been abuzz with gossip were now filled with accusations and fear. Mark, the man who had started the fire, sat in his house, the same house he had avoided for months, sleeping in his truck or with his parents. He had come back not by choice, but because there was nowhere else to go. The house was empty, like his soul, and the scent of Emily's perfume that once permeated the walls had evaporated, leaving only cold and silence. Emily was gone. She had filed for divorce 2 weeks ago, and the papers the mailwoman had brought lay on the kitchen table, untouched, like a tombstone to their marriage. Mark felt no pain when he saw her signature, neat as her handwriting in her school notebooks. He didn't care. She had lost her job, her reputation, her friends, and rumor had it that she had moved in with her sister in the next town over, where no one knew of her disgrace. Steve was gone too. His store, Harris and Sons, was closed for good, the sign taken down, the windows boarded up. They said he had left Pineville, abandoning everything, after an IRS audit and lost contracts had made him a pariah. The last time Mark saw his car was on the way out of town, an old pickup loaded with boxes, driving away into the night like a shadow running from the light. Mark had won. His revenge, which had begun with Emily's intimate photos and dirt on Steve, had spread like a virus, infecting all of Pineville. Mrs. Carter, whose debts had become public knowledge, sold her house and moved in with her daughter. Tina, a co-worker at the plant, quit after her affair with a married man became a topic of discussion. The mayor had resigned under the pressure of articles about his bribes. Pineville was falling apart, and Mark, sitting in his empty house, felt like the king of ruins. But it was a heavy crown, and its thorns were digging deeper. He wandered around the house, his footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The living room, where he and Emily had watched movies, was now like an abandoned theater, the curtains long since drawn. The bedroom, where he had found her with Steve, was empty, the bed unmade, the closets gaping. He found an old photograph in the corner, the two of them at the fair, her hand in his, her smile that had seemed genuine then. He looked at it, but felt nothing, no love, no anger, only the emptiness that grew inside him with each new post on Town Talk. His revenge had made him a winner, but at what cost? Pineville had turned its back on him. People who had once greeted him on the street now crossed to the other side, their eyes filled with fear and disgust. At Joe's, Joe served him coffee in silence, his hands shaking, as if he were afraid Mark would spill another secret. At the plant, his co-workers avoided him, their conversations dying down when he walked in, and Mr. Hayes, his boss, looked at him as if he were a ticking time bomb. Even his parents, Bob and Marge, invited him to dinner less often, their voices full of awkwardness, as if they didn't know how to talk to the man who had destroyed their town. Mark had become as much of an outcast as the people he had avenged, and the irony was as bitter as the coffee he drank alone. One evening, as the snow fell thicker outside, Dan, his childhood friend who had once ducked the truth about Emily and Steve's affair, came to visit. Dan stood on the porch, his jacket dusted with snow, his face drawn, as if he were carrying the weight of Pineville on his shoulders. "Mark, can I come in?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost pleading. Mark nodded, stepping aside. They sat in the living room, where the cold was creeping in through the cracks in the windows. Dan looked at his hands, his fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of his jacket. "You know what they're saying in town?" he began, not looking up. "They're saying it's you, the truth seeker. People are afraid, Mark. They don't know who's next, whose life is going to fall apart. You have to stop." Mark looked at him, his face unmoving, but inside he felt an emptiness clutching at his heart. "Why should I stop?" he asked, his voice as cold as the snow outside. "They all knew, Dan. You knew. My parents knew. You all kept quiet while my life burned. Why should I feel sorry for them?" Dan looked up, a mixture of guilt and fear in his eyes. "You're right, I should have said it. But this has gone too far. You've destroyed Emily, Steve, Mrs. Carter, Tina, the mayor. Pineville is dying, Mark. People are leaving, stores are closing, no one trusts anyone else. You wanted justice, but you got chaos." Mark was silent, his fingers tightening on the arm of his chair. He knew Dan was right. Pineville, his home, was now a ghost town, where people were afraid to speak, afraid to live. His revenge, which had begun with anger, had become a monster he couldn't control. But he couldn't stop, not because he wanted to continue, but because he didn't know who he was without it. It had become his essence, his only meaning. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice hoarse, as if the words were being torn from deep within him. "They made me this way, all of them. I was their fool, their laughing stock. Now they know what it's like." Dan shook his head, standing up. "You didn't just punish them, Mark. You became worse than them. You think that's a victory? Look at you. You're alone. You have nothing left." He walked away, leaving Mark in silence, broken only by the creaking of the floorboards and the howling of the wind outside the window. Mark sat in the dark, staring at the divorce papers he had never signed. He thought of Steve, gone, Emily, her life in ruins, Pineville, which now feared him more than he feared it. He had won, but his victory was as empty as this house. His revenge had made him an outcast, a man shunned like the plague. He had lost everything: human love, friendship, trust. Even the anger that had once burned within him had turned to ashes, leaving only emptiness. He stood and went to the window, where the snow fell like a curtain, cutting him off from the world. In the distance, the lights of Pineville were dim and sparse, like stars on a cloudy night. He could get in his truck and leave everything behind and start over somewhere where no one knew his name. He could disappear like Steve, leaving Pineville to rot in its ruins. Or he could stay to live among these ruins, among the people who feared him but would never forgive him. The choice was before him, but he didn't know which way to choose. His hand fell on the flash drive in his pocket, the last relic of his vengeance, and he knew that no matter what path he took, he was no longer the man he had been. Pineville had fallen, but Mark had fallen with it. Thank you for not being afraid to listen to the end. Take care of yourself. I'll be back soon, and you'll forget about sleep again. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.